When you're first setting out in this hobby, it can be a little bit overwhelming from the sheer amount of things there are out there and all sorts of skills and techniques to learn. But you don't need to let this overwhelm you. In fact, there are a selection of core techniques that are great to focus on that if you learn will provide a great foundation for all the other skills going forward. So in this video, that's what we're going to be looking at. 3 fantastic techniques to focus on when you're starting out in the hobby. The first technique we're going to take a look at is one that I always like to teach to beginners, because this is one that's nice and straightforward to do and get some great results, making it a fantastic confidence booster. And that technique is dry brushing. Now, dry brushing is a technique where you get some paint on your brush and then you find some surface to allow you to work that paint into the bristles and then remove the excess paint and moisture from the brush, leaving you with a dry brush, but one that's still got some paint on it. Now, when you start brushing this across your miniature, the paint that's in there will start catching the raised textures and details, giving you some quick and easy highlights on your model. So it really helps all those details pop out from a distance, which looks fantastic. But because the way you apply it, it is something that's quite difficult to control around very small areas. So generally it's the kind of thing you want to do quite early on in the process of painting your miniature, or across quite large areas, especially ones with lots of texture on them, like fur, for example. But you can do it on just about anything. So for this demonstration, I am going to do it onto a Space Marine. And to do so, what we need to do is pick out the correct kind of brush for it. Because the application of it can be quite punishing on the bristles, you don't want to use your best brushes for this. Instead, you want to go for some more specifically made brushes for this kind of thing. And I have one such example just here. This is a small dry brush from Citadel, and what makes it special is that the bristles are nice and springy, meaning it's going to be great for the way we're going to be applying it, but also this one's quite nice in that it's got quite a flat chisel point to it, meaning you can brush it over quite large flat surfaces. So it's a really nice brush one here. I tend to go for these quite a lot. So what I'm going to be doing is some dry brushing now on a Space Marine, and because we're going to be picking out edges and corners, really this is a highlighting style technique. So you want to go for a lighter colour than what you've already got. My example Space Marine is this one just here, who is currently painted with this colour. This is Marine Blue. And what I'm going to do is dry brush it with a lighter shade. This is Elysian Blue, so you can see a nice step up on there. And so what we need to do is get this set up. You can see I've got some paint here on my dry palette. And what I'm going to do is just get a little bit there on the tip of the brush. Don't need loads and loads of it, but then you need to get something to work that paint into it. Now I've got some kitchen towel here, which has got a nice texture to it, and it's quite tough as well, so it can withstand this brushing motion, because you can see what I'm doing is going back and forth. Now by doing this, I've got that paint into the brush, but also I'm now removing the excess, and as I carry along, you can see it gets lighter and lighter, and having the texture on the paper helps gauge exactly what sort of result we're going to get onto the miniature. Well, for this sort of model, for a Space Marine, we want to go down to about this point just here, and once you've reached that point, you then just start flicking it across the miniature. So if we take a look at his gun along here, I'm going to apply it to this. What I'm going to do is go back and forth in a fairly quick motion like this, and as I work my way along, you can see now that light colour starts catching the edges and textures and bringing them out. Just turn it on its side so you can see how light I'm being with the bristles. I'm only flicking it there like that, and this way I'm just getting a little bit of paint and it's concentrating on those corners. What you should do is just change the angle to make sure you're getting all the edges as you work your way around, which can sometimes mean even turning the miniature upside down, but by doing this we're just looking for those edges and corners and catching them as we go. Now when it comes to smoother surfaces, such as the top of the helmet, you can be a little bit heavier here, and what you'll tend to get then is a slightly different result. It tends to be a little bit smoother and a bit stronger on those flatter surfaces there like that. So you can see gradually building it up, we get that stronger colour appearing there on the forehead. So by just adjusting how exactly you apply it, you get all kinds of different appearances and things. But overall, see, it's nice and straightforward, and you basically just gradually build it up like this until you're happy. And here you can see the result of doing that dry brushing, which I've done across the whole miniature. It really helps all those details and textures stand out really nicely. So a great quick way of getting those details to pop in your models. But it can go wrong. There's lots of ways it can go wrong, but the most common one I see is that people just put on too much paint. And this is very easy to do without even realizing, and I'll show you why just now. What I'm going to do is set up for another dry brush again using the same brush, so the small dry brush and the same color here, Elysian Blue. What I'm going to do this time when I load up the brush is on my tissue roll, I'm just going to focus in the same area and keep going here like this, because if you do this, what tends to happen is you're left with too much paint on your brush, and because you're not moved along, you can't really see what's going on. So if I start applying this onto the model just now, you'll see the result is that we get much more paint and it goes very streaky and doesn't look at all how we're aiming for here, because all sorts of lines and things as opposed to the smooth highlights that we've got elsewhere. Now, that's very easy to do because of it being in one location on the paper, but also you can use the wrong thing to set the dry brush up. So this is kitchen roll, which I quite like because it's quite robust, but some people tend to start out using something like some tissue paper or some toilet roll, that kind of thing. This paper is much more fragile, so if I try setting up a dry brush once again here, see what happens is it's starting to rip the paper surface down there, and I'm starting to get fibers in my brush, which you can see just there, and it looks horrible, and it means that when you start applying that onto your miniature, you're going to get all kinds of fibers and things and all sorts of textures, and it'll just look horrible. So what some people like to do rather than using more robust paper instead is use a piece of MDF, and there's all kinds of ones you can buy specifically for this. I've got a great example here from the Colour Forge, and this one's great because it's got all textures and things on there, meaning that when you're setting up your dry brush, this helps get rid of excess paint, but also you can test it to see what's going to happen on your miniature. Also, being wood, it means that it absorbs away the excess moisture, meaning that you can get the paint to exactly how you need it to be before you start applying it to your miniature. So as you can see, a big part of dry brushing is that setup, making sure the paint is correct before you put it onto the miniature. But if a mistake has happened, what do you do about it? Well, recovering is nice and easy. Basically, what you should do is go back to the original colour that was beneath the dry brushing. So for the case of our example here, that's going to be marine blue. And what we do is just reapply some of this, just thin down, so it just blends everything back down together and basically just sort of tones it all down. So what we'll do is set that up, and to do so, I'd recommend for this kind of thing, just an appropriate brush for what you're using. In this case, I'm using a medium layer brush from Citadel, so a nice standard one really. And what I'm going to do is just introduce some water into my marine blue at the side right there, just pulling some of that paint in, and I'm looking to create a very smooth, almost translucent version of the paint. So bringing it to about that sort of consistency there. With that mixed and ready, just make sure you've only got a small amount on your brush because you don't need very much. And what we do is go back to where the mistake happened, so on the side of the leg right here, and we're just going to reintroduce this colour over the top of the areas where it's all streaky, just looking to avoid the parts that we want to keep as a highlight with the dry brushing. So just there, for example, you see doing this just tones everything back together and just removes that mistake. And there we go, you can see doing that just really draws everything back together and tidies it up nicely. So nice and easy to recover from. And really that's the core parts about doing dry brushing, which as you can see is really straightforward, really fun, really easy to do. A thing I haven't mentioned so far though is that if you're going from one colour to another, make sure that when you wash your brush afterwards you completely dry it before you start setting up for the next dry brush colour, because if you don't, you'll have too much moisture in there and you'll get quite a streaky result in a sort of different way, but an equally unpleasant looking way. But again, as I mentioned, this is a fantastic technique for beginners because it's so easy to get great results with. So if you've never tried it before, I definitely encourage you to give it a go. The next technique we're going to take a look at is called edge highlighting, and amongst more experienced painters this one might raise a few eyebrows, but the reason why I like to introduce beginners to this fairly early on is because it's actually a really core fundamental technique to know, because it's useful in all kinds of different situations and it revolves around two key things. The first is preparing your paint correctly, and the second is learning the right motor control for applying it. Now if you understand these two skills, you'll find actually they reoccur in loads and loads of different things when painting miniatures. So if you can learn this, you're going to have a really good foundation for moving further in the hobby. Now, edge highlighting is actually very common, and in fact, if you look at just about any Games Workshop box artwork, you'll see it on there. If you look closely at the edges of all the panels, you'll see there's a lighter line that's running around each of them. And what this does is emphasizes all the shapes and designs of the miniature and really helps them stand out. So on the boxes, they look great, and on the tabletop, they look fantastic. So that's why it's done so often. And basically what you want to do here is the same sort of thing. Look for any edges and corners on your miniature and follow around those with a lighter shade than you've got on the main part of that area. Now, to practice this sort of thing, there's a really cool thing and really easy thing you can do, and that is to get hold of an old piece of sprue, and that's what I've got just here. This is from some old Space Marine kit. What I've done is undercoat it with Macragge Blue, because this has lots of edges and angles which are fantastic for practicing the functions that we need to do, and also practicing getting the paint ready for it as well. Now, you can do this with any kind of colour you want, except for white, really. I'd go for a darker one here. Then for the colour used for a highlight, you'll want to go for something lighter. So for this example here, as I mentioned, I'm using Macragge Blue. I'm going to be using a nice light blue for my example here, so some celestial blue, but you could really use anything like a white, for example, if you wanted to. What we need to do is get set up, and this is a really important part. In fact, this is possibly the most important part of doing this. What we need to do is thin the paint down to the correct consistency. It has to be thin enough that it flows well from the brush, but not so thin that it flows out of control. So sort of a sweet spot to find, and this is true for all the paints, and once you understand what you're looking for, it's quite easy to find, but it is a little bit different for every paint and for every manufacturer, really. But the way to find it is to, first of all, get a smaller brush. I'm using a small layer brush here from Citadel. Get some water on your brush, and then you can see I've got my paint here on my wet palette. What I'm going to do is introduce the water next to it just there. So I'm going to grab a little bit more actually, put a bit more water there, and then I'm going to start pulling some paint into it. Now straight away what we've got there is a very, very runny, very watery version of the paint, and that's too thin. So what I'm doing is pulling more of the paint into it as I go along. Now if you look, what I've actually got here are 2 blobs of paint, even though it looks like one. That's my main deposit of the paint just there, but what I'm actually using is this mix that we've got just here, and I'm just gradually using this to pull more of that pigment in there to thicken the paint up. And what I'm looking for is that sweet spot where it's going to be thinner than the paint we've got just here, but not super watery as well. Now I think I'm getting to about the right sort of point there, but this process will result with a lot of paint on your brush there, so you do need to remove the excess. So there we go. We can then draw up a little bit fresh, and we can always test it on the palette by having out painting some lines. If they're flowing quite well, you'll be at about the right point, but this feels pretty good to me, so I'm happy with that. So I'm just going to load the brush, making sure I've got a good amount inside the bristles there, then twist the brush so the bristles get pulled to a nice point, and then we can have a go at applying this onto the sprue. So what you should do is look for some edges, such as this one right here. And what I'm going to do is approach with the brush at about 45 degrees from the flat. So if I turn it more like that, you can see the sort of angle I'm looking at just there. What I'm going to do is apply this now in a smooth motion going down here like this. So just a few practice runs, and then there we go like that. That's the sort of thing that we're looking for. You can see that we've now got a nice sharp line going across the edge all the way down, just helping it pop out. As we start to get to different angles on here, we can see the exercise works out really well on a piece of sprue because we now have to start rotating around to do that. But the important thing that I'm doing is making sure that the hand that's doing the painting here, my right hand, is nice and comfortable by bracing the fingers together and making sure I'm always moving the sprue so that that part is comfortable, meaning I have the accuracy as I apply it. Now notice the motion as well is quite a smooth, graceful one that I'm looking for here, because this results in a nice smooth line. If you tend to go quite slowly like this, then what tends to happen is you'll get a few shakes happening, and the result is that the line starts to become a little bit fuzzy by comparison. See, it's not very even compared to what I was doing just there. You want to make sure you just have that confidence just to try and do that swooping motion there like that. Just bring it down, and you'll see the result is much, much nicer. Now, as you're doing this exercise on the sprue, what you can do is start moving on to the next stage if you're feeling confident, and that is to use the tip of your brush, because in your miniature, you won't always be able to use the side of the brush like that. Sometimes, instead, you'll have to use the point of it. Now, what I like to do is line up on the line I'm going to do. So I'm looking at this one right here. You go in with the tip of the brush, and in a downward motion, start following that edge as neatly as you can. So there, like that. Again, that same sort of motion, that smooth, graceful motion, just following it down there like that as neatly as you can. It can go a bit wide sometimes. This one is a bit more tricky, but you see the general process, the same general thing, that we're just looking to pick out that edge with that light colour there like that. Now, when you're doing this sort of thing, remember, being comfortable is paramount. So just rotate it as you need to make sure that you're lining up with that new angle. And this way you can make sure you're nice and steady, bracing your hands once again, and with that tip of the brush, again, follow it all the way around. So as you've seen, having something like this is a really handy tool for practicing technique, but once you're ready, it's then time to put it into practice on a miniature itself. And this time the colour choice is going to become much more important, because what you want to do is go for a colour that's a little bit lighter than what you have as the original colour on your miniature. Now I'm going to go back to a space marine here that I base coated using marine blue. So I'm going to be using Elysium blue as the highlight here, which is just like one step up from it. I'm going to be applying it the same sort of way, same sort of technique. So the first thing to do is to get everything ready on the palette. I'm using that small layer brush once again, and just like before, I'm just going to get some water next to the paint on the palette and then start pulling that pigment into it. So remember, I've got 2 blobs here. I've got the main blob of paint, then I've got the blob I'm actually using, because this is what's been thinned to the correct consistency. Now remember, we're looking for that sweet spot where it's nice and smooth and flowing well, but not so thin that it's running out of control. So you just need to go back and forth until you find that, adding more water if necessary. You can always test it on your palette by having a go at painting some lines, and if it's flowing quite well from your brush, which this is, then you're at about the right sort of consistency for what we need. So I'm quite happy with that. I think we're ready to go. So the first thing to do is to think about that technique where we use the side of the brush, because this is the easier of the 2 ways of applying this kind of thing. And it is actually possible to highlight just a space marine by using this, because these are all the main parts that really stand out. So you can always begin by focusing on those. Remember, for this sort of thing, you want to make sure you just angle the miniature so that you're approaching with that side of the brush at about 45 degrees from the flat, and then just skim along there like that with that smooth, graceful motion. And this way you'll get that sharp edge highlight. Always changing the angle as you need to make sure that you're comfortable as you work your way around. The gorge is a great place for this sort of thing, because this is one that we can again just follow around with that smooth motion, and just around there as well. And then we can do it on the helmet too, starting out with that little vent that we got on the top, where we can actually angle to get the top of it here, just being careful not to catch the smooth part of the helmet. So we can start around there, then we can do a little bit on the front just there like that, and then we can turn it again to do the other side along here, there like that, and then we can go in for doing the forehead as well. Now you notice I've been going for quite a long time with the same selection of paint on the brush. Go back now and then to get a little bit more, but you'll be surprised how little needs to be on your brush to get the sort of accuracy that you need. So it's got some fresh amount here. I'm going to go in to do the forehead just there, just very carefully, going very close to the tip of the brush on that side there. Then again, turn the model so we can get to this side just here. Again, that same smooth, graceful motion to get that highlight along there. As I mentioned, for most of the edges, the really important ones, you'll be able to do them with the side of the brush like that on a Primaris Space Marine, but you won't always be able to. So at some point, you may want to switch to using the tip of the brush. If you decide to do so, it's going to be things like on the face, and when you're doing this, just remember to angle the model so you can access the area and clearly see what you're doing, which might mean sometimes turning the model all the way upside down like this. So in this case, I can get the center of the faceplate just there with the tip of the brush, just gradually practicing that motion before applying the paint there like that. And then we can change the angle to make sure that we get these little vents down the side. Basically, same sort of thing, same process as what we did in the sprue. It's a bit more complex because of the nature of all these different shapes that we've got on the miniature. And here you can see the result of applying that edge highlighting to all the blue armor there. It just really helps all those details stand out so you can see why it's used so often. And the reason why we brought this technique up is, again, because highlighting all those edges and things that really stand out and details is something that you're going to come back to again and again. So it's a good idea to get your head around it and get some practice in there so it becomes easier. Now remember, that trick with the sprue really helps out with that. But the key things to take away from this part are to make sure you prepare your paint correctly. That includes getting it on the brush correctly. And then make sure you practice that motion control so you get those smooth, graceful lines as you're applying the paint to the miniature. The third technique we're going to take a look at is one that's not really a technique as such, but it is nonetheless really important, and that is taking care of your brushes. Now, you've probably heard the phrase that a good workman never blames his tools, and this is a phrase that I find to be a little bit unfair, to be honest, because it doesn't matter how good you are. If your tools are rubbish, you're not going to be able to do a very good job, and this is definitely true when it comes to painting. So looking after your brushes is a key thing, and so what we'll do is start out by having a good look at what makes up a brush. Now, I've got a fairly typical one just here. This is a medium layer brush from Citadel. If we take a look at it, we've got various features around here. First of all, you've got the tip of the bristles, and then you've got the middle of it. This here is called the belly of the brush. Then you've got the ferrule. This is this metal part right here. And then, of course, you have the brush handle. Now, number one key thing is that you mustn't get paint into where the bristles meet the ferrule right there with my fingernails pointing, because if you do, the paint dries there and it starts to force the bristles apart and you lose that fine point. All of a sudden, it's really hard to use the brush. So, for example, you don't want your brush to ever be looking anything like that, because if you do, the brush is going to become a disaster area basically. So let's give that a really good clean, get all that paint out of there, and then we can look at how to do it properly. So once you've got the brush thoroughly cleaned there like that, what you should do is start preparing it on the palette, being careful to make sure that the paint doesn't get up into that ferrule. So of course, thinning your paints is a key thing here. So what I'm going to do is just get a little touch of water there on my brush, start putting it next to the paint on the palette, drawing the paint in there and mixing it. And then when it comes to loading the brush, what I'm going to be really careful to do is to make sure that first of all, we don't overdo it, because what we want to do is get a good amount of paint into the belly of the brush. So think of it like a fountain pen. It's like the ink cartridge, and then it gets drawn down to the tip of it. But it's very easy to put too much in there as you're doing it. So what I like to do once I've got my mix there on the palette is start out by just removing excess paint there like that on some tissue. Then to load the brush, I put it fairly flat to the palette, so like this, around about 30 degrees from the flat of the palette just there, and then I draw it through the paint, going away from it there like that. So then if we take a close look at how it actually looks, you can see we've now got that paint held inside the belly of the brush. It doesn't look like there's a massive amount of paint on there, but there is enough for what we need, because if I try painting on the back of my thumb just here, you can see as I go, what happens is the paint gets drawn down to the tip of the brush, like that fountain pen analogy there. And this way we've got that control over the paint, and it does exactly what I need it to do. Then when it comes time to clean it, it's nice and easy. Just give it a good rinse in the water there like that. And because you don't have any of that paint up there in the ferrule, you can see it's now nice and clean. And so we can move on to the next stage. So we've looked at how to use the brushes, but what about when you're not using the brushes? Well, storing them is really important as well, and you'll find that when you go and buy some new brushes, they always come with these little plastic caps, and you can see on my brush I've got one just here. These are really important. Always look after these because they keep your bristles nice and safe. And speaking of buying new brushes, when you do go and get some new brushes, I find it's best to do it in person, because if you go to a shop and have a look at a variety of brushes from the same manufacturer that are the same size, you'll notice very quickly you actually get variation in each brush based on how long the bristles are, how thick they are, stiff they are, all that sort of thing. This is entirely normal and completely natural, but it does mean, as a top tip from me, I recommend that when you want to buy some new brushes, go and do it in person and just check them and find the ones that you want, because over time you'll find that you favour particular sizes and length and that sort of thing. You want to look for those because this way you'll have more fun when you're actually using them. But when you're not using the brushes and you want to store them, I find it's best just to lay them flat like I've got just here. Just put them to one side and keep them nice and safe that way. Some people like to store them in a cup or something with the bristles pointing upwards, but one thing you absolutely never should do when you're not using your brushes, and this includes if you just put it to the side when you're painting, never ever leave it bristles down like that in water, because if you do, what happens is the bristles bend and you turn your brush into what we call a banana brush. The last thing we're going to take a look at when it comes to caring for your brushes is something that might appear to be a little bit of an extravagance at first, but in my opinion, it's definitely worth it. And that is to get a hold of some brush soap. Now I've got a tub just here. This is some that I bought maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and it cost me about £10. You can see inside here you get absolutely loads of it, and I have used plenty of it. And basically what it allows you to do is really get out any stubborn bits of paint in your brushes, because despite your best efforts, you might find you still get some colour in there, especially around the ferrule. And this is particularly true when it comes to stronger pigmented colours, especially things like reds where it can even stain the bristles. And this soap just helps get that out of there. Now using it is really simple. Basically what you do is just get your brush damp. So I'm just going to get some water on there. And then on the soap, you just start working it into it like that, just moving it around. And what this does is builds up a lather. So I'm just going to really work it in there like that. And you're aiming to get something that looks, well, kind of like that once you've got the soap in there. Now you can also use your fingers just to tease it in a little bit like that, just to massage it in there. And what this will do is start to shift any paint that might be stuck in there. You can always test it on some tissue to see what's in there. So for example, if I just twist it there like that, I can start seeing what comes out of it. There's a little bit of a sort of pinkish hue coming out of there. So some of that red paint was clearly still in there. There's also a few little odds and ends of some dried paint. So it's definitely getting something out. And once you're happy with it, what you then do is just give your brush a really good rinse in some clean water. So really move it around there like that, get anything out of there you can, then just dry it off, and then you're ready to pop the cap back on. And once you've done so, your brush is then ready to be stored. So there you go, 3 fantastic techniques that really every beginner should know. And these are things that I always like to teach people when they're getting started, because they're things that they're going to come back to again and again. Both those painting techniques are really, really useful. So the dry brushing is really great for all sorts of textures, and the edge highlighting is just a really handy thing to practice the motions, because those skills are going to come in again and again. But the third one, whilst it's not really a technique as such, looking after your brushes is really important. And if you do, you're going to find they're going to last you for a long, long time. So we hope you found this useful. Enjoy painting your miniatures.